really wanted to focus on the king tonight and the centrality of the king. Because we who grow up in a culture where we think, everybody's equal. You hear all this equal rights business, and you hear all this idea that nobody's ideas are any better than anybody else's ideas, and nobody's more important than anybody else, and all that. See, that's not the way people thought when they grew up in the kingdom, right? Because the idea in the kingdom, there's a hierarchy in the kingdom. And we mentioned it in our Bible studies. When we go to heaven, when we think, oh, everybody's going to be equal in heaven, that's not how it works. None of us are going to be equal to God in heaven, right? Nobody's going to walk up to a seraphim and say, I'm just as good as you are. That's not the way it works, right? The idea, no, it doesn't mean that, of course, in our world, that means somebody's tromping on you, but that's not going to happen in heaven. But the point is that there's still hierarchy, even though everybody's functioning in principles, it doesn't mean that everybody's the same. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, in the kingdom of God, there's positions of authority and responsibility. Of course, your position of authority and responsibility is based on your abilities to function. The wiser you are, the stronger you are, the more you know, the more you are responsible to minister to those around you that are weaker. So, but the point is that there are beings that have different roles, different jobs, different authorities. God has always created beings that way. And the point is being content with the position that God has given you is part of finding our true happiness. Mm-hmm. Now, you can listen to what I'm saying. You think of Lucifer, you can start thinking of the things that brought about the fall, and then those are the things that kind of infested our minds. We think about being equal, and I'm just as good as you, and I'm not content where I am. I want the highest place. Those are all ideas that came into Lucifer's head, right? That he started to want to be more than what he was, which makes no sense. But anyways. So this idea that we have in our modern mind, actually, at some point we'll talk about it, comes from the French Revolution, but the idea of the kingship and the kingship concepts come from God and they come from the Bible, and this is where the ancient cultures were based on these ideas, that they literally modeled their kingdoms after God, after heaven, or at least their concepts or understandings of them. And of course you can see that they got twisted, but there's these patterns throughout that are similar. So in the kingdom, the king himself is central to the kingdom. He's the central focus of the kingdom. Everything revolves around the king. The king is what is important. All right? He's the source of everything. He's the source of all order. He's the source of social order. He's the source of political order. He's the source of religious order. He's the source of everything. And what I want you to kind of, I'm going to take you to Daniel chapter 4, and this dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and I want to show you this imagery in biblical terms. If you know Daniel chapter 4, this is the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. But this is the only chapter in the Bible that's written by a heathen king. He's a pagan. He's not a Christian, though he actually is becoming one. Right? But it's very interesting. This is the only chapter, the only chapter in the Bible written by a pagan king. It's really neat. But of course, he's talking about his conversion experience. And he has this dream. And he has this dream about a tree, right? And the dream troubles him. And so he asks for an explanation of the dream. And of course, he ends up not getting it from his magicians and soothsayers and enchanters and astrologers, the list of people that are advising the king. And so, at last, verse 8, Daniel came before me. His name is Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God. In him is the spirit of the holy God. So notice the God conflict. My God and then the holy God.
How come they... Never mind.
Okay.
Sorry.
So he says, I told the dream to him and Belshazzar, chief of magicians, because I know the spirit of the holy God is in you. No secret troubles you. Explain to me the vision of my dream that I have seen in its interpretation. By the way, when a king has a dream, and this is going on, obviously since he's the source, he's the connector, he's the connecting point between God and the people, right? He's everything. So when the king has a dream, this is significant, right? He's the God. He's the one who God communicates. That's the idea. The king is actually seen as God in the flesh. This idea of divine kingship comes from the Bible, comes from these ancient concepts. Pharaoh believes that he's literally the embodiment of the sun god Ra in human flesh, right? That the idea of Nebuchadnezzar, that he's the keeper of the boundaries of the god Nabu. That's what his name literally means, Nebuchadnezzar, right? So they literally believe this idea that the kings are divine. They're gods in the flesh. Of this idea of divine monarchy or divine rule, even traveled down through the Middle Ages, that they believed that they were divinely appointed by God to become king, right? So this king has a dream. Now, what's a big deal? Because this must be a revelation from God. You remember the story with Joseph and Pharaoh when he had his dream, same idea. So it says, these were the visions. He says, I was looking, behold, a tree in the midst of the earth. Its height was great. The tree grew and became strong. Its height reached to the heavens, and it could be seen to the ends of the earth. Its leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it. The birds of the air dwelt in it, in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. So what is this tree like? What is this tree?
Tree of life.
It's the tree of life, right? So who's the tree a symbol of? Who's the tree in the dream? Nebuchadnezzar is the tree, right? Nebuchadnezzar is the tree. See, so this idea, we have this tree, actually, there's a river and there's two of them, right? We talk about the tree of life. It's two trees but one tree, right? But this idea that the king is a tree, it comes from the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were put in the Garden of Eden, and he was put there to tend the good trees of the garden, right? You remember in Genesis, there's going to be something about some trees, and something's going to happen about a tree, and I'm going to get him in trouble, get him thrown out of the garden. But the point is that Adam was given dominion, and he was put in the garden, and the tree of life, which is in the midst of the garden, is connected to Adam and his dominion. And when he doesn't have access to the tree of life, what happens to him?
He's cast out.
He's cast out. Is he king anymore?
No.
He lost his dominion. So this idea that the tree is connected to king starts right in Genesis. And you'll see it. There's many stories throughout the Bible where the king is connected to a tree, right? Is your king connected to a tree?
Yes.
Yeah, well actually he was nailed to one, remember?
Yeah.
Right? So the tree of life in the garden in Revelation looks like this, in the Garden of Eden, but the tree of life now kind of looks like this. Your king was connected to a tree, right?
Yes.
Why was he crucified? Well, it said right on the top of why he was crucified. Why is he crucified? Because he's the king. That's what the accusation was. That's what's the charge against him. He's the king. And we say, oh, the Jews, but the truth is he's the king. So that's why he was hung on a tree, right? So this idea of this tree, but what's interesting in this tree is that what's central in this dream is that everything is fed from this tree, right? It feeds everything. All the beasts of the field, all the birds, everything finds shelter. You find shade, you find your protection, you find your food, you find your refuge. Everything you need comes from this tree. See, that's the idea, that's the concept in the ancient world of the king. The king was responsible for the social well-being of his domain. All the blessings, life, food, water. The king was the source of light. And of course, in the ancient world, the source of light was also the source of water. If there's no rain, then something's wrong in terms of the king. If the crops don't grow, if women aren't having babies, whatever it was, they saw everything was connected to the well-being of the king. If the king was doing well, the king was stable, the king was wise, then the kingdom ran smooth and there was blessing. If there was problems, then there was something wrong, right? And so this is where Nebuchadnezzar is having this dream. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
So when we go to heaven, it's going to be the same way. Heaven isn't about you and me. Heaven is about the king. It's all about the king. Now, this king in his beauty, is everybody going to be taken care of? Everybody going to be fed? Everybody's needs are going to be met? Is he going to protect you? He's going to take care of you. But you know, it's all about him, right? So when we go to worship, the worship is all about him. It's because he's taking care of everything. We talked about the banquet table last time, right? The king of the universe is going to be the waiter. He's going to serve you. Well, that's because the king supplies all the needs of his subjects. That's the role of the king. That's the realm of the king. So the king becomes the standard, the stability, the source of everything. This is why kingship is so critical when you read the Bible. These are not just willy-nilly stories. They're telling us something that's very significant, that someday we'll see in a fuller sense. Okay? So everything goes through the king, everything is established by the king, everything is measured by the king and according to the king. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So even the measurements that we have today, use this as an example, even the measurements that we use today to measure things come from the ancient world. And they actually come from kingdom dynamic stuff, right? So we usually think of, if you look it up, you can look up they usually associate like the idea of a foot, which is 12 inches. Well, they usually associate the King Henry, but actually it was way before that. It actually came from Egyptian and biblical times. See, the king was a standard of measurement. Everything was measured according to the king. So we say, well, this is a foot, something's a foot long. Well, how long is a foot? Well, I don't know how long is the foot of the king. That's how long a foot is. Right? Or the idea of a yard, literally a yard was from his nose to the end of his hand, that was a yard. That's how they measured a yard. Or if there was a cubit, it was from his elbow to his end of his finger was a cubit. Wow. Okay? Or if you want to measure horses, they still measure them by hands. Yep. So it was the size of the king's hand, not yours. Right? But so the point is, you want to measure a horse, you do it by. So all these measurements that we still use today, you still use the words today to describe these measurements. Well, these come from another world where the king himself literally determines the standard that we are measured by. Right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
Is our example in all things.
That's right. So this idea, this stuff wasn't a theory. It was very literal. They took everything very literally, right? I love to use this example. Sometimes I'm not in the sanctuary yet, but we'll get there. But in the sanctuary, there was a menorah, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Well, the menorah. This is actually a tree, because we're still talking about trees. It's an olive tree. It's also an almond tree. It's an olive tree, has olive oil in it, and that's what runs the lamp. But actually, at these junctures, these are almond blossoms, and these were very decorated. You can see. Actually, it comes from. Remember, Jeremiah is called to office. There was an almond tree that was on fire. This burning bush idea of Moses. Well, so the menorah is literally a tree. It's an almond tree. And what happens is the branches of this almond tree grow out of the central shaft. And these things, I didn't draw it very well, but you can see that these are all the same height. Okay? But the idea of the central shaft is actually called the canal. Okay? And what happens is these branches grow out of the central shaft, and then they grow up to the stature and fullness of the height of the canal. Right? Because this canal, by the way, this is where we get the word canon from. I brought the canon of Scripture. This is a canon of Scripture. This is where the word canon from Scripture comes from this word canal. This central shaft, if you read Revelation chapter 1, you see Jesus standing in the midst of the 7 golden lampstands. Well, here he is standing right here in the midst. And these branches, I'm the vine and you are the branches, these branches that grow out of this canal, the shaft, central shaft, they grow up, and when they grow up to the same height as the as a standard that has been established. So you notice every one of these branches grow up to the same exact height. Now they come from different points of their experience, but they all grow up to the same height. Does that make sense?
So is that what the Bible means when they tell us to grow up into Christ?
Yes. Yes. We will grow up to the fullness of the stature of Christ. That's right, because he is the standard. That's the whole point. The king is the standard. His character is the standard of entrance into the domain. If you do not have the name or the character of the king, then you do not reflect the king, then you are not part of his domain. Right? And so this is something that we don't really understand. Well, I can do my own thing my own way. No, in the kingdom there is no such thing as your own thing your own way. No, there is only one way and one truth and one life.
But I believe it this way.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So, but the point is, unless you're the king, your opinion doesn't matter. And if there's a question, what do? Well, we ask the king.
That's the canon.
Because he judges all things. He measures all things. He knows all things, right? So the point is, the king is not trying to squash your creativity. He actually gave you the creativity. He gave you that creativity to glorify his Father, to glorify God. But the point is there's no such thing as independence, right? Because this is teaching us that we are to grow to the fullness of the stature of Christ, but we are constantly dependent on the kanah. The branch cannot disconnect itself from the vine and grow on its own. No. As soon as the branch disconnects itself from the vine, what happens to it? It dies, right?
It says, without me, you are nothing.
So, all this imagery of the Bible comes through. God created you to be you. God created you to have your own ideas and to see it from your perspective. But the truth is that what his subjects always do is they subject themselves and their ideas to the king. Only when they glorify the king, only when we begin to see it from the king's perspective, do they actually begin to see it. And so everything is held in subjection to the king. Does that make sense? So this connection is critical, and then from this connection we begin to grow. And the process of our growth deals vitally with our connection to the king, our intimacy with the king, right? So this whole idea of the kanah and the menorah, all this imagery in the sanctuary is actually explaining kingdom stuff. Actually, the sanctuary itself, if you go to Jeremiah 17, verse 12, he says, a glorious place from a glorious throne on high is the place of our sanctuary. The sanctuary is actually a throne of the king. And everything in the sanctuary is symbolism of this kingdom dynamic, kingship dynamic, right? And we'll deal with the sanctuary more later, but Jeremiah 17, I think it's verse 12. Yeah. You want to read that for us, Brian?
A glorious high throne from the beginning is the place of our sanctuary.
Yeah. So whenever you deal with sanctuary imagery, you're dealing with kingship imagery, your kingdom dynamics, right? So all this stuff this was the beauty of it. It's all weaved together in the Bible so beautifully. When you begin to see it, then you just see it everywhere. And that's what's neat about this, because it begins to open our eyes to other aspects of things that we knew so well, but now we get to see it from a different perspective and we get to see the king in his beauty, if I could just put it that way. Yeah. Right? So the king is the standard. The king establishes social order. He's the one that the king himself he wears the crown because he's the son. Malachi, remember? Malachi literally calls him the son of righteousness. But this son and this son are connected. There's a reason why they sound the same. And there's a reason why the words look the same. Because the Son of God is the Son of righteousness. He's the source of light. And this king, what his responsibility or his role was, that the king himself was to overcome the forces of chaos and the forces of darkness. He, the Son of righteousness, would rise in healing in his beams, and he would conquer the dragon of darkness, and he would bring light to the darkness, and he would bring life. Okay? That's why it says rise with him and his beams, because all of us who have been slaves of darkness have been damaged by that darkness. And that sun not only defeats the darkness, but he needs to heal those who have been wounded by the darkness. Right? So this is really interesting imagery, because the ancients, they were so wise, and they saw things so differently. For example, I'll just give you a few examples, but every evening and every morning they saw the battle between light and darkness, right? So for the ancients in the morning, when the sky was all red, the sky was red because the Son of Righteousness had risen, and he had slain the dragon of darkness, and the dragon of darkness is bleeding all over the sky. That's why it's red in the morning. You call it sunrise. But see, in the evening what happens? Well, in the evening, the dragon of darkness, he overcomes the Son of Righteousness, and he slays the sun. And so the sun's red, and the sky's all red in the evening because the Son of Righteousness has received a deadly wound, but that deadly wound's is going to heal. But the same thing happens with the dragon of darkness, right? That they receive a deadly wound, but that deadly wound heals. And so every morning and evening they saw this conflict between light and darkness. They saw the very things that you read about in the Bible. They saw them as everyday occurrences. It's the same idea with the seasons, that the winter was a time of darkness. Right? The days are short and things die. But spring is a time of resurrection. It's a time of life. And the Son of Righteousness has risen with healing his wings. And so there's life and there's light. And then you go through the summer growing season, and then there's the fall. So that there's the same idea, this conflict between light and darkness is constantly taking place. And the dragon of darkness seems to overcome. But then he receives a deadly wound, and then the Son of Righteousness overcomes, and then he receives a deadly wound. And by the way, that's the way the Bible describes it, right? Did Jesus receive a deadly wound?
Yes.
Was that deadly wound healed? Yes. Does the beast of Revelation 13, does he receive a deadly wound?
Yes.
Yes. Does that deadly wound heal? Yes. So you see what you see is you see a parallel. And so what happens is, and this is why I'm trying to share kingdom dynamics with you, is that what you have is you have this positive and negative that happens in the same context. And in one sense, it means one thing, and in the other sense, it means something else. But you're describing the same principle. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you want to talk about, if I talk about the lion in the Bible, who am I talking about?
Jesus.
Jesus. Who else am I talking about?
Satan.
Right. If I
Around for who he would
right.
devour.
If I want to talk about the goat, who am I talking about?
Satan.
Or
Don't know the example.
or Day of Atonement. Are there two goats?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. One's the Lord's goat,
So-
one's the scapegoat.
So
That's right.
a satanic symbol is the 5-pointed star, which is actually the goat's head, right?
Right.
But so that's a symbol of Satan. But isn't the goat the symbol of Christ?
Yeah.
Right? Who's the morning star in the Bible?
Jesus.
Jesus.
What's Lucifer's name means?
Morning star.
Morning star.
Right. So what happens is that just like I talked about the beast receiving the deadly wound and being healed, and Jesus receiving, so you're talking about someone, you're talking about a being who's mimicking and close to, acting like he's the Son, and he has the same name, same imagery. Who's the serpent in the Bible?
Jesus is the one that's held up in the staff in the wilderness.
So, who's the serpent in the Garden of Eden?
Satan.
So what happens? You start seeing the same symbol meaning totally opposite thing, depending on the context in which it is made. Right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
So this idea, see, most of the time when we read a symbol, we get it stuck in our head. It means this, and the ancient will look at you and go, "Yeah, okay."
Depends on
But
what
you just
context
you got one little piece in a sea of information that you're just missing, right? It's the same idea I use, like my son when he came home. I know arithmetic, Dad. I know arithmetic because he learned 1 + 1 = 2 when he was all excited. Well, does he know arithmetic? Well, yeah, 1 + 1 is 2. That's arithmetic, but is that all of arithmetic?
Right.
No. So see, this is what we do: is we grab hold of this. Of one piece of information, and I say, "Oh, I have the truth," and what you have is one example of a piece of truth, but the truth itself is so vast, right? And so most of the time we read the Bible and we, oh my God, that's neat, I learned something, and then we close it and walk away, when in fact that's just an opening door of a vast amount of knowledge that's available to us, but we think we know, so we don't look deeper. But there's more involved. And so trying to understand the symbols and think in terms of these bigger pictures helps to expand our mind to see what the ancients were actually writing when they wrote the document. Does that make sense? Okay.
Close to the forest, too close to the tree to see the forest.
Right. Yeah. And by the way, this is the right tree to be staring at.